Well, Bizzie Gold, I am so excited you're here like I mentioned, it was such a long desired conversation I've been looking forward to. So I'm just so happy our schedules have aligned and that you're here today.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
And also, I just want to mention, I love your name. Bizzie is just the coolest name. And of course, Gold as your last name is just phenomenal.
Yeah, in my childhood, I always did everything competitively, so it always served me well with announcers. Whether it was gymnastics or skiing, like Busy Gold just sounds cool over a loudspeaker. So I was pretty into it too when I was young.
That's so great. Well, I know you've been on quite a journey. So I would love if you could paint a picture for us, if you could go back to your childhood, some of those, if you want to say those beliefs that you developed as a child that made a significant impact on how you operated at a young age and that what that took you and led you into today, of course.
So I think when people look back at childhood beliefs, there are those that they know they've adopted, and then those that are there passively or implicitly that just kind of operate in the background and shift or alter your behavior without you really being aware of it. And obviously, as you know, my work with Break Method, I teach people to also spend a lot of time uncovering those passive or implicit beliefs because they actually direct a lot of your behavior in adulthood and decision making and how you label things. But I would say the things from my childhood that really stick out as positive, intentionally adopted beliefs that made me who I am. Certainly, confidence was always something that was really nurtured in my household, which I know for a lot of people, they might have the consistent, loving, nurturing family, but they're never really taught how to develop self motivation and drive and how to accurately measure their own success and celebrate their own success. And that becomes a problem for them when they're older because they're always looking for their family to be like, good job, instead of them understanding how to say, like, yeah, I'm killing it right now. So I would say the biggest things for me that made me who I am is that I had parents that really taught me how to accurately self measure and to be honest with myself about how I was measuring, because I think that also gets skewed for some people, where their parents are just so wanting to praise them and love on them and not upset them that they end up praising their child for what really would be mediocre effort. And my parents certainly went the opposite direction, which can also be a negative for some. But for me, it really taught me how to have a lot of personal drive, how to feel really confident, and always felt comfortable expressing exactly who I am and never felt like I had to conform or alter my personality or personality expression to fit into my family. So I think those things all made me who I am today. Lots of academic pressure, and the overarching belief with any sort of activity or passion that I had was if I was going to do it and my parents, aka my nannies, were going to actually take the time to be like being my driver, driving me around all these things, then I had to take it really seriously. And if there was ever a moment that I wavered in my commitment to that or seemed like I was losing interest, my parents would just take it away from me. So I always had to be very conscientious of, why am I doing this? Do I have the drive for this? And do I have the drive to be 100% all in on this? And for a long time I did. I think my afternoons after school were like, I went to a private school where we didn't get out till 4 p.m. anyways, but I always have this conversation with my fiance who had a very drastically different upbringing, but it was like, my school started at 7:30 in the morning. We went to 4 p.m. We had sports that were required. And like right after it'd be like gymnastics, dance class number 2, maybe
Wow.
horseback riding. And then I'd have to go home and do homework. So it was just like that every day. And I know on the flip side, a lot of people get to like spend lots of time with their parents and their parents pick them up in the afternoon and they have sit down family dinners. I didn't have any of that. But I certainly had a lot of this bolstering of my identity and who I wanted to be and how to generate self-confidence. So I think that really turned me into who I am.
That's amazing. So, on the flip side, can you share some of those limiting beliefs that you possibly developed when you're a child? Because I know that some of the beliefs that you might have been through or trauma has kind of led you to develop this mindset to also work through them, right?
Yeah, so I would say how Break Method came to be organically has basically nothing to do with my upbringing. But if I look at the things that went wrong for me in childhood and what sort of those implicit patterns were created, I think the biggest struggle for me, instead of my self-expression or self-confidence, mine ended up translating into having trouble trusting other people and being able to be vulnerable in any relationship, whether it was a friendship, a business relationship, an intimate partnership. So that's really the area where I've had to work a lot as an adult to not only learn how to properly delegate or to trust or cultivate vulnerability, but also how to not let that same implicit part of my brain continue to attract only chaotic people that would actually be my nightmare situation. Because both of those things happen, right? Your brain becomes addicted to recreating the scenario by which you put yourself out there and then that person crushes your heart and does something horrible and what you perceive to be a betrayal, and then you do it all over again, right? So as you become aware of these patterns, you have to do two things. You have to address, number one, what you're doing that's not allowing you to cultivate proper vulnerability and learn how to trust and delegate. But at the same time, you also have to address the parts of your brain that are implicitly tricking you into bringing in the very wrong people that will likely never be able to change out of being dishonest or full of betrayal and deceit, right? So you got to do both. You've got to learn how, I always call it in Break, like learning how to change your glasses lens and see people for who they really are, while also learning how to shift the way you're showing up. And if you don't do both sides of that, then you do a lot of work on yourself and keep attracting chaotic relationships and you never get anywhere.
Pattern repeats itself always.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to dive deep into the break method because I know that is one of your biggest things you're serving today, but I do want to know more about you. So I know that you started off the path into yoga, and I'm curious what drove you to yoga and what developed from there.
So I actually reluctantly took a yoga class when I was 19. I had just blown out both my knees in a ski accident. And I had had previous surgeries when I was a teenager on a tumor that I had in my parotid gland. And the thought of having surgery again, because that was such a traumatic experience for me, just to fix my knees was just a non-starter. So I was looking for alternative ways to try to rehab my knees without having to have any sort of surgical procedure. And I remember one of my ski coaches being like, you should try yoga. And I was so like masculine, Olympic lifting, sprints, plyometrics. Like my whole ski background was like the thought of doing yoga back then would have been like just absolutely not for me. Because at the time, the idea of being able to even like sit still and be quiet would have been an impossibility. Simultaneously, this I also was having really bad anxiety attacks all like my whole life from age 19 or 9 to 19, even really into like my like early 20s, was just constantly plagued with anxiety attacks. So it's just like the idea of being able to like stop and sit and be in my own thoughts was like not something I was willing to go into.
Right.
But I ended up going to this one yoga class literally just because at that point I think I felt like I kind of exhausted most of my options. So I just was like, well, what am I going to lose, you know? So I go to this yoga class, and I've told this story a million times on podcasts, and one day I wish that this actual yoga teacher would reach out to me because I only know her name. But her name was Misty. She definitely changed my life. She used to teach at Om Time in Boulder. And I think I only ever maybe took like 3 or 4 classes with this particular woman, but I did have a background as a competitive gymnast, and a dancer. So certainly like when I got into the yoga class, it clearly appeared that I was a much more advanced yogi than I was. I had good body control. And if they said, do this and keep your hips this way, I was like, okay, nailed it. Right. But for me, it was more the mental block of like, I can't do yoga. It wasn't like I knew my physical body could do yoga, but the mental part, I was like, I can't. Just the quiet and the meditation and the chanting, because this was a Anusara studio. So there was a lot of, even the beginning opening of the class was very chanty, because Anusara always opens with the same opening chant. So I go to this class. I actually enjoy virtually all of it. I still don't remember if she played music or not. I feel like she did. I feel like that was one of the things where I was like, okay, I can get into this. And then in Shavasana at the end, she did some sort of guided meditation, and I like went so deeply into it that by the time she was trying to pull us out of it, I very vividly remember feeling like, oh no, I'm trapped. I can't figure out how to get out. Like I had gone so deep that I was trying to follow her voice, but it was like knowing I was 20 floors underground and that somehow I had to get up 20 floors, but I didn't even know where the stairwell was. It was just this like, it was really actually quite fear inducing. And I just remember her coming over and kind of just like putting her hands on my shoulders because I must have actually shown that I looked anxious and couldn't open my eyes. So she was kind of putting hands on my shoulders, and I eventually came out of it, and she was just like, it's okay, you just went really deep. And I was like, yeah. I was like, is that what that was? That was weird. I don't know what that was.
You're like, I've never experienced this.
I've never experienced that because I had never even tried to meditate or anything of the sort, or even just be quiet or still, right? None of that. And then after class, she was like, I just have to tell you that I just have this feeling that you're going to be a famous yoga teacher. And I was like, okay, all right. And she's like, she's like, I just couldn't get over it. And she's like, I just felt like I'd tell you. And I was like, okay. And she was like, is this your first class at the studio? And I was like, no, it's my first class. And she's like, at the studio? And I was like, no, just ever. And she was like, what? So and then I got home, went to my then at that time boyfriend, who actually was a amazing yogi, which is just kind of an odd juxtaposition because he was like, you know, floating and doing all these crazy like press ups and stuff, and he had been really into Anusara, and I was like, nope, not for me. So I went back to him and was like, look at what I learned how to do. I kind of was like showing him all my party tricks, like I learned how to do this arm balance and this transition, and he was laughing, and he was like, on the same day, he was like, I've always told you, I think you're going to be a famous yoga teacher. And I was like,
crazy.
What? So it was just kind of one of those synchronistic days where that seed was planted. And it wasn't that I wanted to be a famous yoga teacher. At that point, it was just like, oh, maybe I actually can do this. And at that point, I knew my ski career was over, which up until that point had always been my driving force in life. It was always kind of the carrot that I was constantly following. So at that point I was like, okay, well maybe yoga could be my thing. So I poured myself into yoga the way I had been taught to pour myself into anything, which is like, you either are 100% or you're 0%. So I just like dove headfirst in and really just completely thrived with it, loved it, and taught, you know, I ended up not choosing that as a primary profession for a really long time. In fact, I ended up going into public relations, and I would always teach like 1 or 2 classes on the side, but I kind of viewed that more as like my hobby or my me time. And I just always really like to, you know, pick really awesome playlists and give people that full experience rather than it just being about like just moving your body or just meditating. I really want it to be like a whole sensory experience because I was always very into music my whole life. So I always taught just like on the side. Even when I was in LA, that was just kind of my thing, was like my side job, until eventually I burnt myself out so much with my PR job where I was like, you know, constantly out with clients. When I was out with clients, I was like chain smoking cigarettes and drinking and like just not taking care of my body. But then at the same time, I was like a raw foodist. It's an odd time. You know, it was like living the LA lifestyle where I was like eating raw food and going to the farmer's market. But then if I was out, I'd be chain smoking with a pack of cigarettes with my clients.
Crazy.
And I'd be like, I'm fine. So I like looked skinny and fit and all these things, but my body, I could tell, was like shutting down from the inside. And eventually I started to have symptoms that were so debilitating that I ended up having to quit my job. I went to all these different, you know, alternative healers to figure out what was going on. I didn't actually figure out what was going on until I was 23. I got diagnosed with lupus, but up until then it was just kind of these odd clusters of symptoms that would kind of come and go. And sometimes when they'd come, they'd stay for like 3 or 4 months, and then they'd disappear for a little bit, and they'd come back always at inopportune times, which I realize now was just me being stressed. So, and I didn't really have a lifestyle that allowed me to not be stressed.
Mm.
at the time. So I eventually ended up, I first moved back to Colorado for a little bit and was only there for a short while before I ended up moving to Hawaii and just completely changing my lifestyle. Lived on a farm, worked on a farm, did the farm thing, farm and yoga all the time. And that was really when I knew that that kind of was my life passion and my calling at that time, was being a yoga teacher, when I finally got to be 100% in. And that was about 23.
Wow. And then you built this massive brand. And I don't believe you do it in a day. I believe you're a part of the,
So
is
yeah,
it called Booty Yoga? Is
Booty, yeah,
Booty Yoga?
BUTI. So yeah, I sold Booty last May to a group of women that are amazing, and I still work with them, and I'm still a minority shareholder, but they run the day-to-day operations, and they're really they're like the real focal part of driving the business forward. I still help advise on where the brand should be going, creating certain types of content, workshops, making sure that our culture and our core values are staying the same. But other than that, they run the operations, which was the part of the business that was really starting to run me into the ground. So I'm very grateful to have found them to be able to run that portion, because now I get to spend more time being a mom, but also working on Break Method. So
Yeah. Well, I just think it's so fascinating that you built this brand that is in like 32, 35 countries around the world, and
yeah, I think now
6,000
it's
instructors.
probably in 40 countries
Wow.
is the best estimate now. And yeah, it's about 6,000 instructors. It's
It's amazing.
a beast, honestly. And people, they think it's so cool, and it is so cool, but when you've built a beast of a company, it's a beast to own and operate also. So like with
Right.
anything, just ask Notorious B.I.G. Mo money, mo problems. Like, as it got
Right.
bigger and bigger, it was just incredibly stressful. And I would say my biggest takeaway from it is that with everything going on in the last, especially like, let's say 4 years, socially, politically, all these things, when you're managing a group of that many people, it's so easy for certain of those groups to, I don't know, kind of lean into this like cancel culture thing and try to use bits of cancel culture to try to like cancel you, but then also try to cancel you to use you as a marketing platform for them copying your thing, which has happened to me like countless amounts of times. So that stuff, after a while, it's like,
you want to remove yourself from it. We could go into that as well, because the cancel culture, oh my gosh, it's a hard one today. It's
so bad.
Mouthful. Yeah. Well, I know that. So I just want to give it credit where it's due. It's remarkable what you've created. And just to think that it's worldwide and over 6,000 instructors. So that's just remarkable. So kudos to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course. Well, I know that I've heard your journey, the divine interventions, if you want to call it, to get you or to go on the path that you never really intended. And I'm just curious if you could share a little bit of how that led you into doing Break Method, which is your baby right now. So
of course. So yeah, I would say the interesting thing is that the divine interventions have always served as a life path pivot, where it's like, as soon as this moment happened, there was no way for me to ever be the same person again. I would say that each one of them still led me on the path that like it would have always included founding Booty, and then it would have always included like going to Break Method next. So I feel like all these things were all connected in my journey, where like for Booty was for me the healing of the physical and the energetic, so that I could actually bring through the knowledge of Break. If I hadn't healed those things first, there's no way I would have been able to bring those things through, because I always tell people that as I'm bringing something through, I have to also be doing the work myself, right? I also have to be simultaneously a student and a teacher. And if I'm not learning it and applying it to my own life as we're growing, then something's off, So, and because of that, as I've created all these different things. Like there are certain people that have known me for a long time that will watch me kind of go through these constant level ups and like micro evolutions as I've created these things. And I think that's a testament to how this does work. Like I'm so drastically different now than I was a year and a half ago, than I was like 3 years ago, and so on. So really, even though the businesses are all distinct, they're all like one point of genesis, which has been pretty cool. So they'll forever be interconnected for me, at least personally. So I would say some of the big ones that stand out would be obviously the moment that I already shared with you, where it's kind of like that day where I actually took the step into yoga. Because I think for some people, they want that moment where the universe like gives them a sign, or like something's really obvious. And some people, I don't think they're not willing to recognize that they in their head might have it built up that it needs to look or feel a certain way. Like it's going to be really obvious, or it's going to be this moment where like the skies part and like God's light shines down on you and you're like, I'm in the right place. Because usually it's the opposite. Usually it's the time that you're kind of like kicking and screaming and you're like, I don't want to do that. Or you're in it, but you're like pissed off to be in it. And then maybe you only realize the power of that moment in hindsight, which I think is probably more common. That's certainly the way these moments were for me. They were more hindsight, like, oh, those are the moments that when put together changed my life. Got it. So, because believe me, a lot of the ones that I'm about to share, some of them are okay, but there are others that were clearly in the moment, terrible, terrible moments. So the yoga teacher thing and getting into that was certainly one that was like the first real about face pivot, because I was just focused on such a different life, where for me it was like skiing and academics and that was it, you know. And then after skiing was off the plate, then I was like, well, I better not suck at school because that's all I've got left now. But then this whole other world kind of revealed itself. And the cool thing is that once you take the step into that new life, it almost lets your destiny kind of reorient itself toward you, because what happened right after that was really like a rapid succession of all these things just showing me like, this is your path. And it was just rapid illumination. Now, for anyone that's listening that's had any sort of spiritual awakening, rapid illumination and following your path is also usually coinciding with a lot of pain and suffering. Like going through that sort of awakening is not usually a like pretty or necessarily light experience, especially in the beginning, and especially if it's happening really rapidly, which for me, remember, to put it into context, I would have been like 19 at the time. And I do think it's important to note that when I usually will just refer to them as pivotal moments, right? These kind of like little specks that when you reflect back, you're like, oh, that changed me forever. There was this one moment when I was probably about 3, maybe 4, that before that, I never really heard my parents talk much about like religion or spirituality or God or anything like that. But my mom had started to read me this bedtime story about bedtime rituals. You know, and it would be like, you know, I'm going to brush my teeth. I'm going to like say goodbye to my siblings, blah, 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 whatever. And she would always skip this one page. And most of the time she'd like grab the 2 of them and do that. So I would never actually see it was on the page. But there was this one day that I realized that the girl was praying to God before she went to bed. And my mom would just like bolt them together and be like, and one day I'm like, Mom, why do you skip the page? And she just looked at me and she's like, the girl's praying and God isn't real. And I was like, okay. Oh, okay. So I remember at that moment being like, God isn't real. But what is God? Why does my mom think it's not real? So it's like for little kids, sometimes if you drop this big picture context question in on them without any context, it becomes really, really challenging. Can you hold on one second? Did somebody knock?
Yeah.
Hello? Sorry. Someone was just
okay.
knocking on my door. So it becomes this big picture looming question by which now the child's brain is not going to stop until it perceives that it's solved the problem. But you also weren't given any context or other relevant information from parents to try to solve the problem. So I actually realized that was one of the main things that kind of really deeply affected this life of anxiety that I would eventually go into, because that's kind of that first fracture of like, oh, so you're saying that the universe is just like chaos and has no order, and there's, you know, there's nothing, I shouldn't trust anything, and let's, you know, anything could happen at any time. So I feel like coming from that, and like my whole childhood up until high school, like never really revisiting anything like that. Like to me at that time, if I ever heard of somebody that was a Christian, to me, that would have been like believing in Santa Claus as a teen, where I would have been like, oh, okay, that person's cuckoo. Because that's how much I was indoctrinated into like all of this, like, this is all complete bullshit, you know?
Yeah.
So to then go into yoga and then have this next experience happen to me, I was like, it was so hard for me because I had been so programmed to basically be like, religion is BS. God and spirituality are just like this made up figment of people's imaginations, which I realize now is because my mom experienced a lot of religious trauma growing up as a Jehovah's Witness. So for her, it was just like, because of that, it's like, this is just a hard pass and I don't even want to bring it into my kid's life. Which to anyone out there that might have come from that background, doing what my mom did is also traumatizing. There's a way in the middle, right? To keep that open and let your child explore and communicate what that means to them, rather than being like, and God's not real.
Yeah.
Right. That gives
our parents don't know at the time that they were teaching these things.
Oops. Well, simultaneously, I was also raised Jewish, so I would like go to Hebrew school and have to do all these like Jewish things, but there was never anything backed with a belief system. It was just like, you go to Hebrew school and you're gonna get bat mitzvahed, and that's just what Jews do. But there was no spirituality attached to it. So as I'm, you know, I do the yoga thing, and then I would say it's hard to say exactly the time frame, but what felt like honestly weeks later, it felt like I was just this kind of like brand new open spiritual baby that was like, whoa, maybe the world is different than I thought it was going to be. I'm walking down Pearl Street one day in Boulder, which is like a walking outdoor mall where at the time, I don't know what it's like these days, but lots of like street performers and hippies and psychics and things just like, you know, all over the street for probably was like half a mile or more. So I'm just walking down there because that was where the yoga studio was. And I think I was either going toward the yoga studio or away from it. Not really sure at this point, but this older woman starts running behind me, like beautiful long gray hair. Like I just remember this like thick braid where it looked like honestly one of the three would have been like my whole head of hair, like thick gray braid all the way down. And she's like running after me on the street. She's like, I have a message for you. I have a message for you. And I kind of was looking at her like, there's a crazy old woman running after me. Like, what? So finally I realized she's talking to me, and I was like, okay. So I stopped and talked to her, and she's like, do you have a minute? And I was like, yeah, okay. And she was like, I have to tell you what I just saw for you. She introduces herself. Her name's Elizabeth, which is also my biological name. She's like, my name's Elizabeth. She's like, I'm psychic. And I was like, okay. And at that point I was like, sure you are. I'm sure. So I was kind of listening to her, but I was also kind of a little shithead at 19, where I was like, I was like baby spiritual, but not really, like still not believing this woman at all. And she tells me about how she saw that I was going to become the most famous student of Dolores Cannon. And I was like, I don't know who that is. And she was like, I literally just, as you were walking, I saw the whole thing unfold. You're going to be one of the most famous students of Dolores Cannon. You're going to take her work to a place she's never envisioned it going. And you're going to be one of her first students. And I was like, okay. And I was like, and what does this woman do? And she's like, she's a past life regression therapist. And I was like, oh, past lives? To me, it was again like, oh, and Santa Claus, is Santa going to be there?
So ironic. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, well, where do I find out about this woman? And she's like, well, there's a metaphysical bookstore right there called The Lighthouse. And she like points, literally like right, we're basically right in front of it. So in my mind, I'm like, great. She's probably trying to just sell me Dolores's books. We just happened to be in front of The Lighthouse, you know? And she's like, I also am a psychic there. And I was like, okay. So I go in and I look at some of the books. And as I'm even just reading the back cover, I'm kind of like, it sounds like complete and utter nonsense, but everything in my gut is like, you have to read this right now. And like none of it felt true. I've always had a really good BS detector for people, but I'm like reading this stuff that in my head is like, couldn't be, no way. But at the same time, my gut check is like, yeah, this is the work they need to be doing. So I was like, all right. So I buy a few of the books. And at that point I was not really into reading. like it was like pulling teeth for me to actually try to sit down and like read consistently for an hour. That would have never happened. But I started with I think the first book I started with was The Convoluted Universe, #1. I think she ended up doing either 4 or 5 of them, and she had many, many books. But I started reading it, can't put it down, like reading it on the toilet, reading it in bed, reading it in the kitchen. It was well over 1,000 pages, and I was done like that. And at the end, I was like, oh my God, I don't know if my life is ever going to be the same. I was like, well, God, what this woman does is so cool. I was like, I want to learn how to do this. So I go on her website and there's nothing. At that point, she's just an author. She does a lot of speaking. At that point, it seemed, even though she was pretty old at that point, I think it was kind of not the beginning of her career, but kind of like, I mean, frankly, it was like the beginning of like internet personalities, right? Because this was so long ago that it would have been like, at that time, for somebody to have an email list, it was like you put your name on the email list and you're like checking every day, like, are they going to email me? Are they going to email me?
Right.
It was like nothing like it is now. Not the same.
Yeah.
This would have been like 2000, I want to say 2002, maybe.
Wow.
Like
yeah.
right where like back then, like even just having a website would have been like, whoa, you've got a website. So I'm like looking to figure out how do I become a student, and it doesn't really say anything about it at this point. It's just like, these are all of her public speaking things. And she's doing a lot of public speaking in like England and things like usually with like kind of alien UFO crop circle type of crowds. And I was like, all right, well, whatever. But I get on her email list and I'm just like waiting. And I'm like, well, maybe this woman's wrong. Maybe I'm not going to ever learn from Dolores. And again, and I don't know if this is just my memory or this is real, but it felt like within a few weeks, it just like everything was just like, and then, because I definitely was still 19 for sure when I became a student of hers. So eventually I see that she's launching a course in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which was nowhere near where I lived, but I didn't care. And I did there's like an application process at that point. Fill out the application, and just like, this woman came to me on the side of the street.
That's why I'm here.
In Fayetteville. Yeah, that's why I'm here. So I ended up going and learning from her. Definitely really magical experience. But also for me, going to that experience, everyone was so much older than me and already had like what would be perceived to be like their skill sets dialed in, like a bunch of different psychics and different types of healers and people, like everyone just had like a thing that they did. And then I just felt like I was just sitting there like this 19-year-old student that's like, I don't know why I'm here, but I'm here. So it was a fantastical experience, honestly, which all culminated in me also getting really excited that I had an appointment booked with her for past life regression on my birthday, right? So this would have been the birthday where I turned 20. So it would have been 2005. Right? We know how old it would have been 2005 is when I would have turned 20. So I met her in 2004. So I was all excited for this, this appointment. And I'm in my hotel room, in this like crappy hotel room. And I wake up, my appointment I feel like is at like 10 or something. I wake up and all of a sudden my voice is just gone. Like I can't talk at all, which is still to this day never happened to me. And I was freaking out to my then boyfriend, like, what? Like, but like can't communicate anything. So I'm like crying. I write Dolores a letter because I realized that I'm not even really going to be able to say anything because it was like so raspy that you couldn't even make out a word. But often she's passed on now, but the way her sessions would sometimes work is that the person that was under when she'd be talking to their subconscious would actually give her like a message or something for what she was going to have to deal with next. So she already came knowing that was going to be the case, that I wasn't supposed to be regressed, but I didn't know that. I just kind of was like bummed. And she delivered to me a message that was really powerful. And I won't give all the details of it, but the overall summary was that I'm a really stubborn person. And I was like, And she basically was like, yeah. And she was like, she would refer to them as the council. The council wanted you to know that you're simultaneously here and on the council. So this group that she usually talks to, according to her, which I've done so much work on this since then, even though I'm here embodied as me, I also am on this council. And that finding out any additional information would only make me turn against my own mission because I'm so stubborn. And that she was just like, you're perfectly aligned right now. You just have to keep going. Like, don't ask questions. Don't stop for directions. Don't, because you will always let that be used against you because you're so stubborn. Just keep going and trust the process. And I was like, okay. So that was a big moment for me too, because then I also had to address the fact that I was like, yeah, I am really stubborn. And sometimes when an opportunity does present itself, I do like actually destroy it. And that comes back to that, you know, the vulnerability trust thing, where it's easier for somebody that doesn't trust in an outcome to be the reason that it's destroyed, so that it's kind of destroyed on their terms rather than just doesn't go well. So then I really had to reflect and look at that pattern where it's like, yeah, I do tend to actually destroy things that I wanted to, so that I destroy them rather than they go wrong on their own. So had to use that pattern to reflect. Ended up at that time going back, doing my PR stuff, still seeing clients, and then eventually ended up digging more into the past life regression therapy as a practice for myself once I moved to Hawaii. So I practiced that in Hawaii for a while and had honestly, some of the experiences that I had right off the start were so mind-blowing that at that point, like, that was all I ever needed for me to like believe in God and other dimensions without any question. Like, there was no, I've seen and heard and experienced and recorded too many bizarre things for me to have any shred of doubt left. So that was, I think, another big moment for me, because that was kind of like me walking through that threshold instead of being like the maybe, but I'm also kind of a little shithead that doubts things. That to me was that final threshold where I was like, no, okay, I really get it. And that was also when I stopped having panic attacks, because it was like, as soon as I realized I don't ever have control, and that actually control for me is one of the worst things that I can seek in my life. And instead I refer to it as controlled surrender, where it's like I'm choosing to surrender on my own terms rather than just like whatever happens happens. It's like, no, I have to actively surrender my destiny multiple times a day.
Wow.
But know that I also have done the work and have the skill set to show up in any of these situations that come to me with grace, with confidence, with any of those things, right? And I think that's really where it's a duality, right? You've got to put all this prep work and do all this soul searching and digging to figure out how you're responding to your environment, while also realizing that you can't ever control your environment either. So it's a give and take. We have to learn how to respond to our environment, yes, and actively learn how to surrender and do the work to also figure out, like, what are we surrendering to? Like, what is our belief system there? Because I'm not here to tell anybody that it should be this way or that way, or your way is wrong. But what I do know is wrong is to not prioritize figuring that out for yourself. Because even people that pretend that they don't believe in anything else, right? It's just like science and that's it. There's still a part of your brain that is still back there doing that thing that I did as a little kid, that's still seeking, like, but maybe, but what if this, but what if that, right? There's still that curiosity. And if you just keep pushing it down and not allowing yourself to explore there, it's going to end up impacting other parts of your the parts of your life that you view to be very practical in a negative way. So I think more people need to prioritize, whether it's like spiritual or existential questions, and like not be afraid to go look at something where you're like, that's BS, or wow, that feels oddly true. Like, go read stuff, learn from people, do some of your own seeking, because you are going to bump up against stuff that feels like a hard pass. But like with me looking at this book where everything in my like New York Jewish brain was like Santa Claus and fairies, there was also part of my stomach where I was like, oh, but this is, I was like, also this is kind of true, and I'm going to read it, right? That's where I think, you need to walk a few more steps. Is like when you have that cognitive dissonance where it's like, every part of my upbringing wants to fight this, but there's also a part of my gut that's like, just do it, man. I think people should welcome more moments like that in their lives.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's what I think is so fascinating about your story. Which thank you for telling all that, because I think it's so intriguing, and obviously it led you on this path, right? So, as everything that has happened in your life, and that's true for everybody. But what I think is so amazing that you did that, even though you were so skeptical, if you want to say, and it wasn't your natural belief to listen to somebody else, you were kind of, if anything, you would naturally turn away from it. What I
Oh
think
yeah,
is so amazing, that I think the biggest takeaway from this is that we should be curious, number one, curiosity, and then also be willing to step into a new space that is uncomfortable, but yet be curious enough to see, oh, let's just give this a chance, and look what happened in your life. So that's what's, I
absolutely.
think, the biggest takeaway is you allowed that to happen. You allowed yourself to step into that bookstore, and you be not a reader to read that. So it's
Yeah.
fascinating.
And I think it goes back to, this is why it's so important to cultivate identity and confidence, because to me it's like, it's not like they're gonna, like, you know, brainwash me into their
Mhm.
whatever cult, you know. It's like, I have
Totally.
so many friends that disagree with me on virtually every topic imaginable, from, you know, spiritual to religious and political, but we can still be best friends, because to me, there's no part of me that is afraid of interacting with information or beliefs or opinions that are in opposition to mine, because I know who I am, and I know that I would never believe something to be true without constant exploration, experimentation, playing with it in my head. Like, I don't believe anything by accident or without embodiment. So to me, being
Hmm.
able to have those conversations with people that do disagree with me, like, I live for those conversations. They
Yeah,
help me either grow, or they help me re-solidify why I already believed something that I believed, right? So
I love
in
that.
them talking to me, it either helps me be like, oh, I never thought of it that way, or they do the very thing that proves my point to me, you know. What, and you know,
Right.
it's a mixture of both, usually the
That's
latter, but
amazing.
that's fine.
That's amazing. Well, let's talk about, I want to go deep into the break method. And what I love about the break method, or what I've learned about you, is that your method is all about deep healing and radical transformation that is sustainable, which is key, right? Because we will learn all these things and, uh, put it in our toolbox, but we'll forget about it, a month after. What is amazing with what the process you go through is the sustainable aspect. So I'd love if you could share a little bit of what is your mission of the break method anyhow.
So I would say the overall mission of the break method is to help people remove the faulty beliefs that they've been indoctrinated with through childhood patterning, that make them see the world around them in a way that is very skewed and usually not even close to objective reality. Because when we're able to teach them how to do this, it solves their personal problems, and it helps them take the action that makes their symptoms go away, right? Their signs and symptoms of things that are drawing them in. They're like, I struggle with addiction, or I struggle with OCD, or I'm constantly blowing up every relationship. Like, that's the experience in their external world. What we help them address is how the internal world creates that, or stimulates that response in their external world. But also, by doing this, we actually teach them how to actually see the world in a much more objective way, that often helps them realign with their personal mission and gets them to then also desire to keep helping other people go through this process. So to me, I always say that I do it for the big picture, because I wish more people had the ability to step fully into their mission on earth, because I do think that it is what is being called for right now, and it's what's really missing. Is people are going to school and they're letting their families program them, and they're learning how to be what they're supposed to be, or be kind of like variant A, B, C, or D, but they're never, often with any ease, turning into just them. They
Mm.
eventually sometimes can get there by way of like traumatic experiences or some of these pivotal moments that come in your path. But the average person, which is what I work with, you know, whether they're in like Oklahoma or London or Australia, they're the people that just they never had a chance to really dig around in there and figure out who they are. And that usually is, at least in part, causing some of these symptoms of uncomfortability in their day-to-day life. So when we can help them get through to that place where they're able to see who they really are and help them essentially take off these glasses and change all the ways that they're interacting with their environment that's creating pain and suffering, then they want to share that with other people, because it's such a powerful, profound experience that once you have it, you're like, okay, everyone needs to have this experience, which is why when people graduate break, it's like all they want to do is just go. Literally, I have one student in Egypt that's like, she always is joking. She says that she goes to everyone. She's like, have you heard the good word of Bizzie Gold? Like, everyone needs to take a break. And you know, we have everything in the group. Age ranges, I think my youngest student's been 17, all the way up to like early 70s. Midwest, rural, to tons of students in Australia, lots in London. We've had a lot of students from Austria, from Germany this semester, like Moldova and Russia, which it's always interesting navigating those ones, because a lot of the cultural aspects of their upbringing come into play. So also I have to learn how to kind of pivot and adapt, because I am very familiar with, you know, certain cultural aspects that would exist in the South or in the Pacific Northwest, just from having dealt with so many thousands of clients now. But it's been interesting to see how these same patterns that I work with then also get carried out in some of these other cultures as well. So that's been pretty cool. We've had a large influx of couples taking the course together, which I couldn't possibly recommend more. It goes so well for them. It really, if you're in the beginning stages of a relationship, completely changes your relationship. My fiance took it in the first few months that we were dating, and we have a completely different relationship because of it.
Oh, that's amazing.
And then we also have people that, you know, are on the verge of getting divorced, and this is their last ditch effort. We've had people that have been married for like 15, 20 years take the course. So it doesn't matter what stage of the process you're in. Everyone that takes it eventually comes out on the other side, literally like, how can I literally tell everybody about this process that I just went through? Because I would say the most common thing that people experience when they come to break is that they'd previously done so many years of what they would consider more traditional therapy modalities, or been collecting self-help books. And this is the first thing that actually worked. And when they get to the end of 16 weeks, they're like, oh, like that's the end. Like, yeah, okay, bye. Like I did it. My life is different. My relationships are different. There's always this like, holy shit moment where they're like, and then that was that. And then often they'll stick around and they'll audit and they'll intern and they'll volunteer at our events and stuff. But, you know, it's 16 weeks. Like, it's not like a therapy thing where it's like every week, it's like, see you next week, see you next week. And then you're just kind of like, where's the finish line? Or like, where's the measurement process here? It's incredibly structured. And I don't ever expect, the expectation generally is that, so they have an exit interview at the end of what's basically 4 months. It's about an hour long. And then from that document, what we go through there, I expect that they fully rewire for the 30 days after graduation. But I would say 98% of people, by the time they show up at exit interview, their life is so drastically different that, I mean, and this happens even in Unit 2, where it's like, literally you'll have a small group with somebody that was kind of like meek and had trouble answering questions. And then all of a sudden on small group 4, everyone in the group is like typing in like, who the fuck is this? And I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, where was this person? Where did you just come from? I
love it.
So yeah, the transformations are really rapid and they're sustainable because it's not dependent on me. And a lot of people will keep doing that. Well, like, can you just answer it for me? Can you just give me the answer? That's not the way I do things. We always help, we give them all the tools and lecture content and interactive content to form a hypothesis, give them all the ways to test it so they come up with a conclusion, and then I will verify whether that conclusion is correct or incorrect and explain why. But if they didn't have to go through all those different processes, they wouldn't ever be able to continue to do that for themselves. And if I didn't teach them how to do that for themselves, I'd be a horrendous teacher and I wouldn't be able to live with myself.
Well, yeah, it's the self-work that we actually have to do. We have to go through the method to arrive at our own answers.
Absolutely.
And that's going back to the basis of your program. So I know our brain is pretty hardwired when we're very young. I forgot if it's
Oh
age
yeah.
7 or something, or subconscious
So yeah, I
mind.
would say in my work, almost all of your, at least we call them origin source belief patterns. You've got an origin source belief pattern and adaptive. Origin source belief patterns really get anchored in between age 2 and 5 with the most
Wow.
repetitive adverse experiences. And then usually the adaptive is somewhere between 10 and 12. So how you then try to adapt out of that to try to keep yourself safe or away from the pain stimulus, that's usually that 10 to 12 kind of like bordering on middle school, where it's like you feel like you have just enough autonomy or independence to try to get out of it. That's usually where that adaptive pattern kicks in.
And why do you feel it's so important that for us to tap into our subconscious mind and learn to reprogram it?
So a variety of reasons, right? So it's so common that you will, let's say, read a self-help book and it tells you like, I'll give a hypothetical example, and this is kind of a BS example, but let's say like the top 10 things not to do when going on a first date, right? So it's like, you can read that and be like, okay, great, check. Don't do this with my hands. Don't do this with my voice, like don't bring up, I don't know, like deep questions from
Next
the
or something.
past, whatever. Yeah, don't bring up an ex, don't drink too much. These are all things where it's like, yeah, we could read them and be like, check, yep, got it. That's going into your semantic memory. And that is not capable of overriding your subconscious directives. So when you're on that date and all of a sudden they're giving you a look that's triggering your childhood brain to be like, they're going to reject me, or they're looking at something on my forehead, it doesn't matter how many times you read that book. You could have even taken a test on that book. Your subconscious is going to override and make you do something with your behavior that is at odds with what you just read. And unfortunately, this is the case even with a lot of courses, right? Like they're teaching you how to do all this self-discovery work. I feel like the big issue is that there's not enough balance where people are either having you go backwards but not address the present, and then the link between the two, or they're having you just deal with the present but they're not going backwards, and they're certainly not linking the two. We address the past, and not just the past that you're drawn to. I think this is one of the key pieces of break, is that the past memories that you're drawn to or that you think are the ones are never the ones. That's why we do so much work to essentially trick you into not knowing why we're seeking a certain answer, so that your protective mechanisms can't push back against that and lie. Because very often our brain will just lie because it's like, nope, we don't want to change. We know, ourselves. Yeah, we know this, we're good. So it'll pick these moments that you feel like are these big crescendos and latch onto them when they're almost never even closely tied to the pattern, even a little bit. So we actually have a process by which we extract all these moments from your subconscious without you knowing how or why. Then we teach you how to piece them together so that you can be like, holy F, I would have never seen how these things went together. It can be a pretty mind-blowing experience, even just that portion. But then we address then how to move these pieces around to understand what the pattern hypothesis is. Then we use all the stuff happening in the present to test the hypothesis, come up with the conclusion, and then rewire all of our present behaviors. So what we're doing is we're actually creating a congruent track by which your subconscious directives are now rewired and healed, because we knew what the pattern was and we knew how to actually shift it and rewire it through repetition of alternate behavior choices, then changing your present behavior and learning things in your semantic memory for how to kind of disrupt the process, so that you merge these onto one track, so you're not constantly having two parts of your brain fight with you. Because most people, like the first date example, it would be like, don't drink too much, don't bring up an ex, and then all of a sudden something happens and you feel like they're losing interest, and then you like do the thing that's weird with your hands, or you change your body language and you're like, oh god, I look fat in this position, and then maybe you're like, I'm just gonna have one more sip of wine, when it's like that wasn't your plan. But once you got in there, your plan is no longer top of mind because now your subconscious is driving the car. So we teach you how to make sure that we're addressing both of those and merge them back together, because you can't just deal with one. And if you don't have these intentionally merged, no matter what you do, you're always going to keep running back into the same problem over
Same
and over
pattern.
again.
Yeah. And actually, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this when it comes to dating. We're dating the same guy over and over, just a different body, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being is we're attracting the same type of person because of, obviously, we're the common denominator in the dating in the people we date. So we will say, oh, like, I keep on attracting the same man. He's, non-committable, and he's this, that, and the other. Why is that? And we don't think there's actually a problem per se. We don't think to look at ourselves like, why is this the case?
Well, and it's usually a two-way street. You and all of your subconscious patterns are also what he's attracted to, right? So at the same time, like, you guys are probably both each other's type, when the reality is that if we were both to actually do the repatterning work, both of you would not be each other's type.
Right.
You're like the antithesis of each other's type. You're in break, what we call each other's symbiotic dysfunctional pair. You guys have the exact pattern that is meant to create toxicity and not actually heal the pattern or rewire the pattern, but instead just constantly exacerbate the problem.
Absolutely. I remember I had one of those situations. and funny enough, the process I remember I went to is really getting clear of, who am I being? Like, am I actually being the person that can have what I want per se? Like, who am I being? And actually looking at my patterns and what is not in alignment of who I want to be in my life, my authentic self. Right. And it did take a lot of work to get to that, like, really being radically responsible and honest with myself. Like, oh, how could I expect respect from somebody if I'm not being respectful to myself? Like, that's completely bogus. It makes no sense.
Absolutely.
So I know that, of course, and also when it comes to the stories we tell ourselves, we attach this emotion, which in turn creates our reality, right? So we have to change our emotion, the meaning around our story, to actually, to look at it as like life is happening for us, not to us, and, taking that radical responsibility.
Absolutely.
So how can we start to change those patterns and live our fullest potential? Like, what is the process you go through? Is it just breaking down, like getting, because I think you talked about this before, is rapid triggering, I believe.
Yeah. So the easiest way to describe it, right, in the course, which is 4 months long, and this is a potentially crude visual, but I'm sure everyone is able to conjure up the image of a lab rat in a maze, where the lab rat doesn't realize it's in a maze, but the scientists that are experimenting on it realize that it's in the maze, right? So they're changing the different variables inside of the maze to get the rat to essentially behave differently based on the stimuli that they're adjusting. So if we look at the School of Sustainable Self-Mastery, the 4-month course itself is like you going into this closed environment where we're intentionally making you, walk into a door. So you can be like, that really hurts. And it's like, then it's like, turn left. And as soon as you turn left, you're understanding exactly why it hurt, but also what reaction and what thought directives were given to you at the time that it hurt. So there's this constant process by which you're being intentionally triggered and then taught to both observe what that experience was like, and then taught in a very like college course type of way why and how to actually shift it. And then the next thing is actually like a door opens, then you go into an opportunity to do what we call field work, which is when you're actually embodying that out in your life, then getting triggered again. So you can be like, okay. So it's not a relaxing 4 months. And I always tell people that in the beginning of the course, there are going to be plenty of times where I'm going to be your least favorite person. I've had plenty of people. I used to teach some of these in-person seminars, and I'll never forget the day that I saw that she finally admitted the truth on her paper, and that I kind of glanced and saw it, which she was going to present it to me anyways. And I kind of just gave her a pat on her back, and I was like, I'm really proud of you. She crumples up her paper, shoves it in my face, tells me to go F myself, and like storms out. And I was like, she just got to the truth. She'll be back.
That's so funny.
So there is that moment, right? Sometimes when we get past that barrier that your brain is so used to getting you to block, when we do get there, there are different types of reactions. Some are angry, some are sad, and some are like, finally, you know, if somebody's been in therapy for 20 years and they've never gotten to that moment, when they finally get there, even if it's like brutal and awful and like what they've uncovered is terrible, they're going to be like, oh, thank God, right? It's going to feel like relief. But it's hard to say what that experience is going to be for everybody. But I'll tell you one thing, even people that have like cursed at me, thrown paperwork at me, left our private forum being like, F you, Bizzie, F this course. A week later, they're like, hey, I'm back. Turns out Bizzie was right. I just had to sit with it for a second, you know? I've also had another person show up at an event once and I was like, oh my God, I haven't seen you in like 2 years. And she was like, yeah, you told me something that I really didn't want to hear. And I spent the last 2 years resenting you like a lot. And then one day I was like, oh, she was right. And I was like,
wow,
hi, welcome back. So people's reactions are going to look a variety of different ways. And our graduation rate for the course is over 90%. So most people actually like finish all the way through to graduation. And then those that don't usually just audit for a few semesters because they might need to learn at a slightly slower pace. But it is this it's why we call it structured self-inquiry. It's like the antithesis of journaling. Like there's no process where it's like, we ask you a question, then you've got to think about it and write about it, because that allows all of your source belief patterns to just get vomited out on the page, and that's not helpful. So it's more a process of experimentation and teaching you how to extract this information from your brain. I have one of the slides in like our early lecture, if anyone remembers seeing the first Mission Impossible, where Tom Cruise has to break into Langley and they like drop him down on a zip cord from the top, but there's like heat sensors everywhere and like lasers, and he's got to like,
oh yes,
and
yeah,
remember the cord like at the last minute kind of like it goes a little bit too far and then he's like almost touching the floor. That's how we have to remember. Yeah, right. So that's how we have to get into your brain, is like we have to get in as undetected as possible to get out the right files so that you have the information to work with. And so many people, if they knew how or why we were doing it the way that we were doing it, they would have touched a sensor at the very top. They wouldn't have gotten to the bottom with all the files ready to get pulled out. So we try to get everyone to the bottom with the files so that then we can then shift modes and look at it more like college lecture content. So it's like there's always this kind of like raw extraction process and then right into a lecture where it's like, and now put on your college lecture hat and your glasses, and then now we're going to talk about you as if it's not you, right? So it's like there's always this like uncomfortable part of extracting and then shifting into observation mode and learning how to actually work with your stuff in a way that feels very much like, in the beginning, dissociative, but it actually, I've seen what works so well about that is that a lot of psychiatric conditions that from a Western medical philosophy are like untreatable or have a terrible prognosis, because of the way the information's extracted and then they're then looking at it from this dissociative perspective. I've seen a lot of types be able to actually work on and treat behaviors that through a Western practice they'd never be able to do because they wouldn't even be aware of them, because they'd still be in that denial mode where their reality is so fractured that they're like, I don't do that, right? It's like everybody else's fault.
right.
So that's probably one of my favorite things about how the course works, because I've seen so many people have that massive breakthrough where like then when that person changes, then the next semester I have like their mom, their cousin, their, brother-in-law, like everyone from their town, which that's gotten interesting because with the referrals, we try to split everyone that knows each other so they're not in the same small group. But I literally had a few semesters where it would be like, I'm so-and-so's cousin. I'm like so-and-so's, brother-in-law. And I'm like, all right, I don't know how I'm going to split you guys all up because we have like a whole town from Kansas in this group right now, but okay.
Actually, we're talking about the triggers, because as we know, everybody loves to avoid the triggers, as you just went in the whole explanation of that. So those triggers, I know, it elicits a response in us. So how does one go through the process to disrupt those triggers and create a new response, to actually like not go to our subconscious mind, but actually be able to be like, hey, okay, I don't need to respond this way. I acknowledge I am triggered. Like, when does somebody get to that space,
So
you want to say?
at least in our course, they get to the initial phases of that in Unit 1, where we teach a concept that I call Eli. And it's a process by which you actually learn to override and disrupt your emotional response system with logic/universal consciousness, and be armed and equipped with the right questions to ask yourself in real time to get you to shift out of the way that your brain was attempting to respond to the situation, and rather now seeing the situation for what it is in the present rather than what the past means about the present, because that's usually how people relate to triggers. I would say there's a few things here. People are very unaware of what their triggers are. Even if they think that they know what their triggers are, they don't realize how deep it goes. So that's number one. We do extensive work on mapping those. But like you said, it's very commonplace for people to avoid triggers or take this like kind of radical position of like, I'm going to cut all the triggers out of my life, like cutting out toxic people, right? Even though like you are also part of that toxic relationship and you're not addressing how you're interacting with it. So in those ways, we are very much going into triggers and tracking triggers and not allowing ourselves to avoid them or to associate some sort of blame role with these triggers. Which I understand, like, let's say somebody has a physically abusive partner, right? It's not like we're trying to take away from that behavior or minimize it or say that they're not doing something wrong, because they absolutely unequivocally are. But when we look at that toxic cycle in an example, you were still attracted to this person and likely attracted to this person multiple times before this person, because usually when somebody ends up with a physically abusive partner, it's not the first time. And it also usually is something that is present in some way, shape, or form in childhood, maybe not toward them, but witnessing it or experiencing it in some way on the periphery. So when we look at something like this, while it's never okay for somebody to be abusive, and that they certainly need to be addressed in that way, we do still have to address the person's essentially attraction and responsibility in this relationship and how they're potentially interacting with this person in a way that might trigger them into that behavior. Because I have frankly seen relationships where the couple did have a few abusive situations, and I've worked with both the husband and wife, and we've completely gotten them out of it. So that's not to say that that's always the case, because it's not always the case, because sometimes the other person's not willing to do the work. But it's so tempting in our society to be like, oh, that person's toxic or that person's a narcissist. I have yet to see somebody that has been told that they're a narcissist in a true like deep dive work like this actually be narcissistic.
Wow.
They're the narcissist in relation to somebody else being perceived to be the victim. But either party, when looked at as an individual, doesn't necessarily exhibit all those symptoms. It's just exhibiting those things in the context of relationship. So something like that, it goes back again to that symbiotic dysfunction. It's like to say that you are this it would be doing everyone a disservice to be like, sure, you can stick with that label, you know, like that label fits you 60% of the time, because then they usually let that label perpetuate or be the excuse for all their other behaviors. So we really try to get out of that in this work.
And that's
going into your triggers is like the most important thing you can do, because rewiring your response to the trigger is what's going to change your life, not learning how to avoid the trigger.
Absolutely. The only time we could change is actually facing what is going on in our life and doing that deep work. And I think that's the problem with the cancel culture, is it's all blaming and not actually thinking about your part in something, and just kind of being everybody just being a victim of the situation, but they don't take the responsibility of their part in it. And I think
and I don't think they're really not stopping to think about kind of the one part mob mentality, one part groupthink, and then I hate to say it, but one part trendiness, which I've said a million times. I'm like, political affiliation and like cancel culture is like the new Gucci bag. If you don't have the right thing or say the right thing or a part of the right cause, then you don't have the newest Gucci bag. You don't have the new Hermes bag. That is a very dangerous, scary place for us to be in as a society, and I refuse to participate in it.
Yeah, I completely agree. Oh my gosh, there's so much goodness in this, and I can go on and on because I think it's such a the work you do is so deeply seated, and there's so many layers to it. And I think really when it comes down to it is taking a hard look at herself and getting to the root cause of it, because there nothing is on the surface. There's
No.
always, like you said, there's tons of layers, and some that we might think is one trigger is actually goes back to something way different. So it's quite interesting and intriguing. And I love the work that you're doing. Like I said, I've been wanting to have this conversation for so long, and
That's awesome.
and I thank you for describing what the break method is, but I know everybody can learn more about this on your website. And yeah, it's just so intriguing, and you're a phenomenal speaker and all the work you're doing. And
Thank you. I appreciate that.
and of course, very authentic. And I love that about you.
Thank you. And I'm happy to give your listeners a discount code. You and I can
that'd
figure out
be
what that would be. Where fall semester starts tomorrow, actually. So based on whenever this comes out, winter semester would probably be the next one. So winter semester will be open for enrollment January 1st to the 11th.
And people start on the day that, because it's like a school, right?
It's like school. There's like a school supplies list. The more you treat it like a college course, the better the experience is going to be for you. Because if you kind of go into it like, oh, well, I don't have to print that, or I don't have to organize that, it's going to come back to bite you in the butt later. Because there's over 220 hours of lecture and significantly more work than that. And you're going to end up having a binder like this thick with like little color coding tabs. And you're going to want to go back to that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
I joke, like when my fiance took the course, he took it obviously at the same time I was teaching it, but I made sure to give him a different facilitator. When he was first going through it, if I would get anywhere near his binder, it would just be like immediate uncomfortable body language. And I'm like, babe, I'm not gonna look at your binder. And he's like, you can't look at I was like, I'm not looking at your binder. But even if I would get in the same room, it's like, oh, like all of my truth is in there. That's how we want it to be, where it's like what gets extracted in the beginning. And unit 1, it's so uncomfortable that the thought of a loved one knowing that much truth about you just makes you want to throw up. But then eventually in unit 3, it's like, then came the moment where he's like, hey, I'm ready to sit down and go through this with you. Like, so cool. You know, and I'm like, yes, this is awesome. Because people, you've got to get okay with yourself first and learn the why. So it's not just like, I just have this ugly thing, but I don't know why. It's like, here's the ugly thing, but this is what I found out it came from, and this is what it does to me here, and this is how I'm working through it. Then because there's a strategy, it's not just like, here's this stigma, you know?
Yeah.
So it's pretty powerful, and I would love to also gift you the course too. So if you at some point want to take it, I would love to gift it to you.
Thank you so much, Bizzie. I appreciate it. Well, to wrap up this call, like I said, I want to go on and on, but I always ask my guests, what is, if you were to write a book, I don't know actually if you have, but if you were to write, are you going to write a book?
Well, yeah, I have two books that are about to be launched right now. One of them, I've had my editor literally like, is it done yet? Is it done yet?
That's amazing. Okay. So writing a book, if you were to put a piece of advice on the first page, what would you share with others?
So, and I can say this because it essentially is the summary of my first book, is that your brain is a dirty, filthy liar. So people take their thoughts and their beliefs as truth, and they also take them as theirs, but they haven't done the work to realize that likely 80% of their thoughts or more are not actually their own thoughts. They're being brought into, let's say, the screen of your mind, but they're not actually generated from you. They're generated from the subconscious. So the best piece of advice I can give is, at all times, get back to that place where you can be an observer of your thoughts rather than somebody that's just constantly acting on every thought that you have. Because I'm sure we've all had that moment when you've been going through a breakup and you're already like heartbroken, and then your brain is like, let's listen to this really sad song. And then it's like, as you're listening to that song, your brain's like, let's look at the top 10 worst breakups you've ever had, where it's like just trying to get you to sink deeper and deeper while you're like wanting consciously to pull yourself out. The brain often doesn't have your back, and it's not telling the truth. And I love, this is kind of the analogy I've been using lately. For anyone that's seen the kids movie, The Croods, Have you seen the Croods?
No, uh-uh.
So it's about this last remaining cave family, and the main character, Mr. Crood, he's kept his family safe by keeping them in this cave, right? So there's this beautiful world out there, but he keeps them all in the cave, and he makes them all run through these rules like, what's the number one rule? Always be scared. Fear keeps us alive, right? And like that's their thing, but they never live outside the cave. Eventually they have to leave the cave because then their cave is being threatened. But when they're out there experiencing this world, they're like, what? Why would we have just wasted all this time in the cave? And the dad's like, it's safe in the cave. Your brain tries to keep you in the cave based on all of its previous childhood experiences and rules that it's created. But usually the life that we are desiring only exists outside of the cave. So anytime we try to take a step outside of the cave, the brain is now at odds with us. So if you just go into the next like week of your life, let's say, observing what these thoughts are and actually listening to the thoughts rather than just being the one passively thinking, write them down. I have a tool on my website. I'll share it with you if you want to share it with your listeners. It's like a weekly thought journal so that you can kind of figure out where are these thoughts coming from? Is there a general category that these all belong to that they have in common? Observe your thoughts and start to dissociate from these thoughts in a way where you're saying like, not only are these thoughts not true, but they're logical and they are being created to keep me in the cave, and the life I want is outside of the cave. So I'm literally just going to start hitting the delete button. You would be shocked at how far even just that can take you if you're willing to really dig in and do the work.
I love that. Yeah, I'd love to share that with everybody. That would be great. Well, Bizzie, this has been such an honor. I deeply appreciate your time and everything you've shared today. Thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everybody.